If you enjoy my videos, then please like, subscribe, and share. Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart, and another edition of What the Hardware? This, for the uninitiated, is a Raspberry Pi 4. If you don't know what it is, it's a single board computer, or SBC for short, that is very inexpensive and you can do lots of things with it. As you may have guessed, the Raspberry Pi 4 isn't the first model of the popular SBC, it isn't even really the fourth model. There have been many versions of the Raspberry Pi over the years, and this is the most recent and by quite a margin the most powerful. A popular use for Raspberry Pis has been to create an inexpensive retro gaming machine out of them, particularly using the OS image Retropie. The Pi 4 came out in a surprise launch near the beginning of summer 2019.
As you all know, the key to victory is the element of surprise. Surprise!
With several hardware and connectivity changes that disrupted the standards that had been established with the prior mainstream models. It changed things up so much that just until a couple of weeks ago, on April 28, 2020, there had been no official version of Retropie available for the system. Now that there is one, I figured why not take a look and show you how it performs and also let you know what you need to do in general terms to set it up and how difficult it is. Just keep in mind, this isn't a tutorial, consider it an overview. Now if you think you're an emulation expert because you've been playing retro console games on Windows, Macs, or Android devices for years, or because you ran some pre-built hack for your classic or mini console, well buddy, the Raspberry Pi is here to kick your butt.
I'm gonna kick your butt.
Now don't get me wrong, it's not crazy impossible or anything like that. After all, lots of people have set Pis up and used them as emulation machines. But you're going to have some extra patience and either technical know-how or the ability to do research to get everything working optimally. I'd rate the difficulty of building a Pi 4 based retro system at the high end of the beginner scale. Let's begin with what you physically need to get going. First off, there's the Pi itself. These days you can get it with 2 gigs of RAM for $35 or 4 gigs for $55. For emulation, the 2 gig model is really all you need. The price is only for the board itself, it literally comes with no accessories of any kind. Next up, you'll need a 3-amp USB-C charger. Note that if you have the original release of the Pi 4, some high-end USB-C chargers won't work with it. So to be safe, you'd probably want to buy the official one. Newer Pi 4 releases are less finicky. Next up, you'll need a micro HDMI to full HDMI cable. There are 3 sizes of mainstream HDMI connectors. Micro is the smallest, and that's the kind that the Pi 4 uses. The Pi 4 has 2 micro HDMI connectors, but if you're only using one TV or monitor, you only need 1 cable. Also, I don't recommend using a size adapter to change from one size HDMI to another. Just get the cable, they're cheap enough, the adapters can have problems. Next up, you'll need a micro SD card. If you're thinking of playing CD-based system games, I'd say 64 gigabytes is the minimum you should be looking for, and at 128 gig would be better. Next on the list is a controller of some type. You can probably use an existing one you already have. The Pi 4 has USB ports and Bluetooth support, so you can use things like your Xbox One or PS4 controller with it. Next, you'll need a keyboard of some type to help you change settings or use with old computer emulators. Any existing USB keyboard should be fine. And then next you will need a computer with an internet connection and some way for it to read a micro SD card. Finally, this is optional but highly recommended. I would suggest that you get a case for your Raspberry Pi, particularly one that offers some type of cooling option, either passive, like a heatsink, or active, like a fan. And I'd say it's especially recommended if you want to overclock to get the highest possible performance out of your Pi 4. Now if you're starting from scratch or close to it, and let's say you need to pick up many things like a Raspberry Pi, a USB-C charger, a micro SD card, and a micro HDMI cable, in May 2020 as I record this, you're probably looking at a total price of around $85 to $100 for a complete setup. It'll be even more than that if you also need to pick up things like a keyboard or game controller. How much you personally will need to spend to get up and running will depend on exactly what components you already own. Here's my Pi 4 in its case. I bought this case off of Amazon and it came with this fan. I'm not a big fan of the layered design, it was pretty difficult to put together, but there are tons of choices when it comes to cases for the Pi 4. I went with this one because the heat sinks were included, and its fan connects directly to the GPIO pins on the Pi 4. You have your Raspberry Pi 4, but it doesn't seem to do anything. Now what? Oh yeah, it needs an operating system to run. Now I'm going to show you the official Retropie here, but there are lots of other retro gaming-centric OSs you can get. Things like Laka, Batocera, and the like. There are also lots of unofficial images that come prepackaged with commercial games, but I'm not going to talk about those. They're naughty. To be legally above board with everything, you should only be using ROM or image files from games you actually own or games that are freeware. Plus, you don't learn a thing from installing those prepackaged OSs, and if something goes wrong, you might have a hard time fixing it without understanding how Retropie actually works. Now then, here is the official Retropie site. I'll put the link to it in the description below. Again, while this isn't a tutorial, I'll tell you just the basics of what you do. You download the image for your version of the Pi here. Then you need a program to write the image to an SD card. The one most people recommend and use these days is Balena Etcher, which you can get here. And again, the link will be in the description. Then you write the image to your SD card, stick it into your Pi, plug the Pi in, let it start up, and then you're in Retropie. After that, you'll have to get your game files onto the SD card. Windows can only read the area of the SD card that has some of the configuration files. It can't read the Linux formatted partition that actually stores the games without special software. But we're not going to delve into that. You can either SSH or FTP into the Pi, or you can transfer your files over USB. How do you do a USB transfer? Simple. Grab a preferably empty USB thumb drive, stick it in the Pi until it flashes, put it back into your PC and open it up. You'll see a bunch of folders. Then you put your ROMs, ISOs, or whatever in the appropriate folder for the right game system. Put your BIOSes in the system folder. If you need help with this, I suggest checking out tutorials from other channels like ETA Prime or someone else that does loads of those. Now the fun stuff. How does it run? Let me note before I begin that I have my Pi 4 overclocked to 2 GHz versus the stock 1.5, and the GPU is overclocked to 700 MHz versus the 500 MHz standard. And these settings have been very stable for me. I haven't had any issues related to the overclock. For systems that are 16-bit and below, basically anything you want to play on it will run just fine. No, cycle-accurate emulators may not be full speed, but you'll be able to play most 16-bit and below games with few to no issues. So in the game console and portable world, that'll cover things like the Atari 2600, 5200, 7800, the Lynx, the SG-1000, the Sega Master System, the Game Gear, the Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, 32X, the NES, SNES, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, TurboGrafx 16/PC Engine and CD, Neo Geo, and many arcade games. On the computer side of things, most of the popular microcomputers from the 80s and 90s are supported and will work just fine. You'll be able to run Commodore 64, Spectrum, CPC, MSX, Atari ST, Amiga X68000, and more. For some of the computer emulators, you'll want to have a keyboard and mouse hand. So those systems are all typically a given, as they ran fine on the Pi 3 and 3B+. What about newer stuff? Well, that's what I'll show you now. We'll take a look at some PlayStation, Saturn, Nintendo 64, Jaguar, Dreamcast, and PSP games. We begin with the original PlayStation. And you know what? I'm not going to spend much time on this one. Not because I don't like it or don't care about its games, but because it generally runs fine. Here's a look at a few games on it so you can see for yourself. PlayStation on the Pi 4 and Retropie is generally fine, but there may be some games that have issues. So you may want to hit up compatibility lists to see if your favorite game runs and how it runs, if you're interested in buying a Pi 4 primarily for PlayStation emulation. Next up, Sega Saturn. Saturn emulation has made some strides within the last year or so on multiple platforms, but it's still quite immature compared to other systems overall. I don't say that to denigrate the people working on it. It has unique challenges, but the point is, right now performance just isn't there for Saturn emulation on the Pi. If you're lucky, a game will run at roughly half of its intended frame rate. Many run much slower than that even. Bottom line, if you were thinking about getting a Pi 4 for Saturn emulation, don't. The current Saturn emulators available for the Pi will likely never be close to full speed on a Pi 4. Maybe a new one will come along that runs better, but I'm not holding my breath. Here we have the Nintendo 64. Not one of my favorite systems, but it still has stuff worth playing and loads of fans. How does the Pi 4 handle N64? Generally kinda good, but it's still pretty far from perfect. Performance will vary by game. Some run great, and others, well, don't. Here's Mario Kart 64. This one runs great. Almost perfect. Almost. But more than good enough to just enjoy messing around with. Here's GoldenEye, because people like it for some reason. As you can see, this one runs pretty good, but it isn't perfect. The frame rate is unstable even on the real cartridge, but it's worse under emulation on the Pi 4. And here's a look at some other games just to get a better idea about what you can expect from N64 emulation performance. You can also note that Retropie offers multiple emulation cores for N64, so you can change between them and you may find one that works better for some games than others. So N64 emulation on the Pi 4? Pretty good, not great, far from perfect. Again, I wouldn't buy a Pi 4 just for N64 emulation. Hey look, it's the Jaguar! Anyway, how do games run? Let's see! Here's Rayman. Now looking at this, you might get your hopes up. Jaguar Rayman looks pretty damn good running on the Pi. Without the overclock, it runs notably worse. Now I didn't play it start to finish or anything like that, so I can't promise it keeps up this level of performance for the entire game, but yeah, pretty impressive. Now here's Aliens vs. Predator. You might think this game runs really bad and there's no way it was this bad on the real system. Well, on the real system, this game is kinda choppy AF. But even so, this does run slower than the real thing, even with the overclock enabled. Ordinarily, I would enable the FPS counter to get you a precise reading, but the problem with that is I've noticed the FPS counter for RetroArch is not accurate on the Pi for some reason. I can just tell you I've owned this game since it was new, and this is close but isn't quite full speed. Here's Atari Karts. Whoa. What the actual... Yeah, this game runs absolutely terrible on the Jaguar emulator on the Raspberry Pi 4. You can enable frame skip if you want better speed, but that comes at the expense of smoothness, and personally to me is not acceptable. I'd rather pull the system out of my closet and hook it up than play a game on an emulator with frame skip. So this is clearly way worse than the original system. The Jaguar verdict: most games run significantly slower than on a real system, even with an overclocked Pi. A few games run okay and may be playable. In general though, yeah, don't buy a Pi if you want to emulate Jaguar games. The Sega Dreamcast. A cult favorite and often considered the first modern game console for the way it handled graphics. Dreamcast emulation works through the experimental core of Redream, a popular emulator for multiple other platforms that you might know from, say, PC or Android. If you want to play games rendered at a higher resolution than the standard Dreamcast resolution, or have multiple save state slots, you'll have to pay for this emulator. Otherwise, you can use it with games rendered at standard DC resolution with just one save state slot. And just a note, I had a hell of a time getting Redream working. It would crash as soon as games started and kick me back to Emulation Station, which is the graphical interface for Retropie. It turns out that one of my virtual VMUs, Dreamcast memory cards, was corrupt and I had to delete it. And then after I did that and launched Redream again, everything was fine. So the games. Here's Dead or Alive 2. For this game, it runs at full speed most of the time with the overclock and also a lower output resolution. If I have the image render at 1080p, it gets pretty choppy and you can see the frame rate drop. Anything lower than that, it's almost a 60 frames per second lock, which is pretty impressive. It does still drop from time to time, but The lower the output resolution, the smoother your performance will be. And here's a look at Unreal Tournament. It's an example of a game that does not run well on Redream on the Pi 4 at all. It typically runs at about 2/3 of its normal speed, sometimes hanging around even half speed. So please note the actual game has an unlocked frame rate, but kind of hovers around 30 frames per second most of the time. It can go either higher or lower than that. So when you see 40 frames per second on the screen here, it's not the game itself running at 40. It's basically showing you that the emulator is fast enough to render 40 out of every 60 frames in that same amount of time. So the best we can muster on an overclocked Pi 4 is roughly 67% of the full speed experience for Dreamcast Unreal Tournament. Here's Grandia 2. You know what? It ran really good. I didn't really notice any frame drops, so let's move on, shall we? The final Dreamcast game I'm going to look at today is Daytona USA. Now this game does have some issues with Redream in general, particularly with some audio and control problems, and I've run into these on a powerful PC, so it's no surprise that these same issues are present on a Pi. Now as you can see, it also doesn't run at full speed here. Daytona on the Dreamcast is basically locked at 60 frames per second, while the frame rate in Redream on a Pi 4 is inconsistent, especially if you're outputting at higher resolutions. And I'm not talking about rendering the Dreamcast graphics at a higher resolution, I'm just talking about drawing the emulation surface on a higher resolution output window. So what's the bottom line for Dreamcast emulation on a Pi 4? Well, it's pretty impressive, but it still has a ways to go. Many games are not consistently full speed, even with the Pi overclocked to 2 GHz and set to the lowest resolution. And coincidentally, 2 GHz, by the way, is exactly 10 times the speed of the Dreamcast's original SH4 CPU. I tried more than these 4 games, and yeah, you'll find some that are pretty consistently full speed, but a bunch of them aren't. I'd suggest hitting either a compatibility list or related Redream or Retropie forums to see if the game you're interested in runs at playable speeds on a Pi 4 before taking the plunge on one, if your intent is to use it for Dreamcast emulation. And now the newest system in the list, the PSP. PSP emulation, like emulation of other high-end platforms on the Pi 4, will be hit and miss depending on the game you're running. Some games run beautifully, even if you up the resolution to as high as 3 times its native resolution, with no noticeable frame skipping at all. Other games will struggle mightily, even at native 1x resolution. So let's have a quick look at a few games. Here's Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. This game runs really well using the emulator PPSSPP, and it's even pretty safe to bump the resolution up to 2 times native and still get really good performance. At 3 times resolution, you will definitely experience some skipped or dropped frames here and there. The problem is much less evident at 2 times resolution. Once again, I didn't have the time to play this from start to finish, but it ran very well all the time I spent with it. Next up, we have Darius Burst. Darius Burst runs pretty well, and you'll see that it runs full speed pretty much all the time at 1x resolution. You can even bump it up to 2x resolution and get full speed almost all the time, with only occasional slowdown when you have screen-filling transparency effects, such as when you approach a boss fight. I don't recommend bumping it up above 2x though, because anything above that will make the game so slow and inconsistent that it's not really playable. So overall, if you're playing Darius Burst at 1 or 2 times resolution, yeah, you'll have a great experience on the Pi 4. Next we'll have a look at Wipeout Pulse. I chose this game because in the past it has not run too well on low-end hardware. And unsurprisingly, it doesn't run too well on the Raspberry Pi 4. Now, even at 1x resolution, you will notice this game slow down if you don't have frame skipping enabled. If you bump the resolution up to 2x, you'll notice it slows down a lot more and you might drop down to 40 frames per second most of the time instead of 60. Bump it up to 3x, and I saw a lot of the time the game was running at 20 frames per second. I even tried it at 4x just for a laugh, and yeah, it was sub 20 at different points in that resolution. So this is one game that's definitely not playable on a Pi 4. I mean, you can maybe squeeze some fun out of it at 1x resolution, but it's so chunky I don't understand why you really want to play it that way on a big screen. Next, let's take a look at Tomb Raider Anniversary. This is another game that, like Wipeout and even notoriously God of War Chains of Olympus, does not run well on low-end hardware. And we'll see that borne out once again on the Pi 4. There are parts of this game that will run buttery smooth at 60 frames per second. The problem is you might get a few seconds at 60 frames per second, and then everything will come crashing down to earth with a frame rate that maybe goes as low as the teens for a few seconds. It's just all over the place. And if you play the same game on a real PSP or on a high-end computer using PPSSPP, you will not see this type of frame rate variation. So what's the verdict for PSP on the Pi 4 then? Well, I hate to say it once again, but it really depends on the game you want to run. Many games will run fine, either at full speed or very close to it at 1x resolution. Fewer, but still a fair amount, will be fine even at 2x resolution. You may even get lucky with a few that you could run at 3x. Then you've got a smattering of problem games that you basically can't really run consistently at all. Once again, check lists and forums to see if the games you want to play are full speed before picking up a Pi just to play PSP games. So there you have it. Now you know exactly what a Raspberry Pi 4 is, what you need to get it up and running as a retro gaming emulation system, and just how well it performs in emulating systems beyond the 16-bit era. Would I recommend the Raspberry Pi 4 to you if you're brand new to console emulation? I would have to say probably not. Only because there are way simpler ways to get into it. So if you just want something that's easy to get your games up and running on, a cheap Android TV box will give you roughly the same performance, and in some cases at about half the cost of a total Pi setup. Alternatively, you can also get a cheap used business PC and get way better performance. Now, I would recommend the Raspberry Pi 4 to people who have an interest in computing in general, wanted to see what single board computers are all about, or wanted to get into something where they can totally customize their experience and spend a lot of time getting into the nooks and crannies of how everything works. You see, building a single board computer emulation system is a fun little project, and you can work on it with family or friends, and then once you've got it all set up, well, you can keep having fun with it after that. And that's going to just about do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. Do you have a Raspberry Pi 4, or any other single board computer for that matter? If so, what are you using them for? Go ahead and share it with everyone in the comments below. With that, I will say, thanks for watching, and see me later.